Welcome, my fellow creatives. Today I'm here to teach you how to center clay on the potter's wheel. There are a couple important things to note initially. Number one, if you have long hair like I do, you're going to want to pull that back so that your hair doesn't get caught in your clay while it's rotating on the potter's wheel. And secondly, it's really important to take off any jewelry that you might be wearing that you don't want clay to get caught in. Okay? Let's get started. First, you'll notice that we're not at school. We're actually at my home studio. If you look to the right, you'll see I have some tools and some clay on a work table, my potter's wheel with a chair, a light source above, which is really quite useful, my washer and dryer, and of course a sink where I can clean everything up. Okay, to get started, the first few things you'll need are a bucket full of nice cool water, a needle tool. They look a little different. Our studio needle tools are different. The concept is the same, something sharp and pointy like a needle. A yellow rib tool that looks just like this, a sponge, and also a wire tool. Notice I've already pre-wedged my clay and I've shaped it into a nice round mound, which is close to what I'm going to want it to look like when I'm done centering it. I'm using plastic clay, which means it's soft and malleable and easy to work with. I should be able to manipulate it without much trouble. Really squishy. I've gone ahead and wedged it to remove any air bubbles because those can cause problems later on. For instance, not allowing my clay to become centered. And I also made sure that the clay I was using was all at the same stage. For instance, all plastic instead of some really soft clay mixed with harder clay like leather hard clay, for instance. Okay, now that I've got it wedged and I've shaped it into a nice rounded mound, my next step is going to be sticking it down onto the wheel. And you'll notice I smacked it down and I aimed for the middle of my potter's wheel, which is indicated by the lines, so kind of like a target. And I'm going to shift it right on into the center and give it a good press. Make sure it's actually adhered. Now on to centering. With centering the clay, what I'm really trying to do is get out any inconsistencies so that when the clay is rotating, like so, I don't see any lumps, bumps, or wobbles. It should just be even and smooth, just like the wheel. One other thing to note, your potter's wheels will all have a place to turn them on the right-hand side, and most of them will just turn on and off, but some of them have another lever which allow them to go one direction versus the other. If you're throwing right-handed on the potter's wheel, you'll notice that my wheel is rotating counterclockwise. That's for right-handed people, and that little lever on the side, when I stop my wheel, if I flip it, will allow the wheel to go clockwise for those of you that might want to center left-handed. When centering clay, there are 3 very important hand positions that I'd like you to try first. Those hand positions are whale tail, kind of like my wrists together, and it looks like a broad whale tail. From there, I'll move to something called goalpost. My hands will essentially kind of tighten up and look like a football goalpost. And then lastly, I will cross my thumbs over one another. And I call that the bat, sort of like, a little bat flying through the air. And I'll explain the importance of those as we move through. Also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start working from the bottom of the clay, then to the middle of the clay, then to the top of the clay to kind of put the components together so I'm not centering the clay all at once, which is rough on my hands. It takes a lot more energy. I'm kind of working it in phases so that it's a little easier on me. To get started, I'm going to scoop myself back so that my arms can be rested on the splash guard. That way they're stable, and I know that I can hold my hands stable to remove inconsistencies in the clay. I'm not wobbling around. If I'm wobbling around, the clay will never actually become centered. I'm going to use fast speed. I'm going to take my sponge, grab a little water, and add a little bit of water onto the clay so that I don't get friction when my hands come in contact with the clay. And you can add as much water as you like or need as you move throughout. Next, I'm going to go into my little whale tail position, and you'll notice I'm going to use this part of my hand to only try and get the wobble out of the bottom of the clay here. So stabilize on the splash guard, put into whale tail, and kind of push right here. And you can probably see that a lot of the wobble is gone down here, but it still remains up top. So I'm going to move into my next position, which is the goalpost. And if you look here, you can see where I was actually kind of pushing on the clay, just like that. Goalpost, I'm going to be pushing into the clay right here, and that's going to kind of press into the center part to try and take out the wobbles. Again, my arms are on the splash guard, and I'm trying to take the wobble out of my hands so that it takes the wobble out of the clay. Lastly, I would take my thumbs and put one on top of the other. This is the bat. And what I'm using is my thumbs to press this clay down into where my hands are already tight to take some of the wobble out. And I'm kind of moving down just like so. Now, I'm going to very slowly release my pressure so that I don't throw my clay off when I remove my hands. And you can see it's looking pretty close to centered up top, but there's still some wobbling in the sides. Okay, so the only way to really know if it's centered is to have it moving and kind of look for these wobbles and bobbles. And I can see that I still need to move through the process again. And it's okay to move through the three hand positions multiple times until you get your clay perfectly centered. Because centered clay is crucial for being able to throw things that are even and symmetrical on the potter's wheel. It really is the most fundamental step, and everything depends on it. So make sure you take time to do it correctly. So I'm going to go back to my whale tail. I'm going to hold tight at the bottom. This time I'm going to move a little bit more fluidly through the steps. So here I am into the goal post, and here I am using my thumbs to kind of push the clay down into the tightness of my hands. Now if a little clay comes off, that's all right. That's just my hand kind of hitting the clay in a way and removing it. And you'll notice I'm going to move through this one more time here. So I'm going to whale tail. Notice how I'm really trying to take any wobble out of my hands. If my hands are moving like this, then my clay will too. So if I can remove the wobble out of my hands, then I will be able to remove the wobble out of the clay. And I'm going to slowly release my pressure. And here you can see I've got my clay perfectly centered. Everything is looking good. Okay. So when you get your clay centered for the first time, I'm going to ask that you either call myself or another student over to verify that it is in fact centered. And then I'm going to ask you to do something that you might not like. Ready? I'm going to ask you to throw it off center, because it's really, really important that you learn how to quickly move through centering again and again and again, because it is the most fundamental step, and everything that you make depends upon it. So throw it off and then move through the steps again. Couple things that can go wrong. When I see people starting to center clay for the first time, sometimes people push too hard with one hand, and they'll get it centered, but then eventually it'll become uncentered because the hand pressure is not balanced in between. Another thing that can happen is people will hold their hands a little bit above the clay, kind of like this, and they'll create this ledge underneath their hands. And if this is uneven, for instance, let me just make it uneven like that, what will happen is your hand will rest on that as you're trying to center the clay, but can you see what's happening as my hands are on this uneven clay? They're moving around like this, so there's no way that I'll actually be able to get rid of the wobble if my hands are trying to stabilize on something that's uneven. So you can take your sponge and hold in the opposite direction. Pull that clay off. I'm just holding tight, and then I can let it go into the splash guard so that I don't have an uneven surface. And then I can go ahead and just hover my hands right above the potter's wheel, right about here, and then have a nice smooth surface so that I can actually go ahead and get things centered properly.